Ever notice how so many government buildings look like they just came straight out of ancient Rome?
Yeah.
All those columns, those domes. It's like you're walking through a history book.
Right.
And it's not even just like government buildings. Even some homes built back in the 1800s have those Roman-inspired features.
Hmm.
Makes you wonder, why were early Americans so into ancient Rome?
You know, what's really fascinating is that it wasn't just an aesthetic thing. This whole fascination with ancient Rome was like really intertwined with their vision for the new nation. And you can see that reflected in everything
Yeah.
from their architecture to their like whole education system.
You've sent us some really interesting stuff about this. I'm excited to dig into it all with you.
Yeah.
So we're diving deep into like why the founding fathers and early Americans were so into ancient Rome,
Mm.
how they modeled their government and even their lives after it, and what all that means for us today.
It's almost like they were looking back at this ancient civilization like a blueprint for building their own republic, you know, drawing on its successes and trying to avoid those mistakes.
I see, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's start with something that's impossible to miss, especially in a city like D.C., the architecture.
Right.
It's like stepping back in time with all the grand buildings, all decked out with columns and porticos and domes. Like, what was the thought process there?
Well, it wasn't just about looks. They were using architecture as a way to like promote their political message.
Oh,
This style, called neoclassical architecture, it was picked on purpose to
Mhm.
bring to mind that whole Roman Republic vibe.
okay.
Think of it as a kind of visual propaganda,
Mm.
sending a very clear message about the ideals of this new nation.
So they were basically saying, out with the old monarchy, in with the new republic, just through their building.
Exactly. They wanted to separate themselves visually from the British monarchy and all that it stood for.
Uh-huh.
And what better way to do that than by going with the architectural style of a republic that had actually overthrown a monarchy centuries before?
That's pretty clever.
Yeah,
And it wasn't just about looks.
right.
They felt like these grand neoclassical buildings actually stood for the values they wanted for America.
Totally. They saw the Roman Republic as like this model
Okay.
for balance, stability, and strength.
Mm-hmm.
Those massive columns and those imposing structures weren't just for show, they were meant to embody those ideals.
Yeah, it's like they were saying, we're building a nation that's just as strong and enduring as these Roman structures.
Exactly. And remember, this was when America was just starting out, you know,
Mhm.
still trying to prove itself on the world stage. They needed to project this image of strength and stability, and architecture was a big part of that.
There's that great example of Thomas Jefferson, right?
Yeah.
And his thing for a specific Roman temple
Yes.
in Nîmes, France.
Yeah,
Didn't he pretty much base the Virginia State Capitol on it?
he did. Jefferson, huge fan of Roman architecture. He even had a model of the Maison Carrée, that temple, shipped all the way to Virginia
Wow.
and used it as the inspiration for the Virginia State Capitol building.
So he wasn't just saying, hey, we should build in this style.
Right.
He was pointing to specific Roman buildings, like as models.
Yeah, and it shows how deep these Roman ideals were in the minds of the founding fathers, you know? It wasn't just some abstract thing, it was a concrete influence on their choices.
This whole Roman influence wasn't limited to those big buildings in government, was it?
Oh, no, not at all.
Everyday Americans were into the whole Roman aesthetic, too.
Oh, absolutely. It was this massive cultural phenomenon. People were giving their kids classical names, like Augustus, Cornelia. Women were wearing those flowy Grecian-style dresses, and men were even styling their hair like Roman statues.
It's like they were trying to embody this Roman ideal in every part of their lives.
Exactly. It's almost like they were saying, we're not just building a new nation, we're making a new way of life, and we're looking to ancient Rome for inspiration.
It's really interesting how they managed to weave those ancient ideals into their own
Yeah.
culture. What do you think made them want to live the Roman dream, so to speak?
Well, I think part of it was rejecting the old world.
Mm.
They had just fought to break free from British rule, and they were searching for a new identity, you know,
Wow.
a fresh set of values to define themselves by.
So they saw in Rome this ideal of a republic,
Exactly.
a society where people actually had a say in their government, where
Mhm.
civic virtue was a big deal, and where individual liberty was valued.
Right. And they believed that by, like, emulating Roman culture and those ideals, they could create a society that embodied those same values.
But let's be real for a sec. Adopting Roman fashion and names is one thing.
Yeah.
Did this whole fascination with Rome go deeper than that?
Oh, absolutely. Education was a big part of it. Latin and Greek weren't just for the brainy types. They were seen as, like, essential for any good education.
Interesting.
They thought studying the classics was, like, crucial for developing critical thinking, logic, and a strong moral character.
So instead of just focusing on practical skills, they saw real value in studying ancient languages and history.
Exactly. It was about more than just facts. It was about shaping the minds of future citizens. They thought that really getting the classics would help build those virtues and skills that a thriving republic needed.
Wow, it's so interesting to think how different that approach to education was compared to ours today.
Yeah. And this emphasis on learning the classics eventually led to that idea of Western civilization, is shared heritage, connecting Europe and America through this common intellectual and cultural tradition.
So by immersing themselves in Roman and Greek culture, they were kind of putting themselves in this larger historical story.
Precisely. It was a way of connecting their brand new nation to a line of amazing civilizations, drawing legitimacy and inspiration from the past.
It's amazing how this one ancient civilization had such a huge and lasting impact on how America developed.
It really is. And that impact can still be felt today in ways we might not even realize.
Now, we've talked about all the good stuff about this Roman obsession, but as with any comparison to history, there are going to be some, well, complications and contradictions.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the biggest contradictions is the whole issue of slavery.
Yeah.
Both the U.S. and Rome were slave societies, but the way slavery worked in each was super different.
And that's a really important difference to point out, isn't it?
Definitely.
Because it shapes how we see the complexities of this Roman influence on America.
Right. You see, Southern planters would often compare themselves to the Roman elite, arguing that, slavery freed them up to focus on governing. But that whole comparison kind of ignores the brutal reality of American slavery and that huge difference, the racial component.
So while both societies relied on slave labor, Roman slavery wasn't based on race or ancestry like it was in America.
Exactly. It was more about conquest and prisoners of war. And look, while that doesn't make Roman slavery any less awful, it's crucial to understand how each system was distinct when making those historical comparisons.
Right. We can't just gloss over those differences.
Yeah.
It reminds us that history is complicated and nuanced, and we got to be careful not to oversimplify or make parallels that don't really hold up.
Exactly. And as we keep going with this deep dive into this Roman influence, we got to keep those complexities in mind and look at both the good and bad sides of that legacy.
Well, I think this is a good spot to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot, from buildings to slavery,
Yeah.
but there's still more to unpack.
Yeah, definitely. We've only scratched the surface of this whole thing. You mentioned how everyday Americans tried to live out that Roman ideal.
Right.
It reminds me of, like, this one guy who perfectly embodies that whole concept, Cincinnatus.
Cincinnatus.
Yeah.
The Roman citizen soldier
Yes.
who left his plow to go lead the Roman army and then just went right back to farming after saving the day.
Exactly. No craving for power, no ambition for a throne.
Yeah.
He became like this ultimate symbol of civic virtue, putting the needs of the Republic above his own, personal gain.
Yeah.
And this idea, it really resonated in early America.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, George Washington himself, they often compared him to Cincinnatus.
Yeah, that makes sense. After leading the Continental Army to victory in the Revolution, Washington resigned his commission and went back to his plantation at Mount Vernon.
Exactly.
He could easily just grabbed power,
Right.
but he chose to step back, just like Cincinnatus.
It was a powerful statement,
Yeah.
rejecting that allure of power and stressing how important civilian leadership was over military rule. This really cemented Washington's image as a selfless leader,
Right.
dedicated to the Republic, not to his own ambition.
Okay, so we've talked about architecture, values, education, and even this whole Cincinnatus ideal.
Right.
But how did all this translate to the everyday lives of Americans?
Yeah.
Did they really try to live out this Roman idea of, like, active citizenship?
Absolutely. Remember, the Romans believed a republic thrived when its citizens were active participants, not just passive bystanders.
Right.
And this idea really struck a chord with the founding fathers, who were trying to make a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Yeah, to borrow Lincoln's famous phrase.
Right.
So it wasn't just about copying Roman looks.
Yeah.
It was about embracing those core values
Yeah,
of, like, civic engagement and responsibility.
exactly. They truly believed that active participation in civic life, debating issues, putting the common good first, these were all key
Yeah.
to preventing tyranny and corruption.
Yeah.
And this idea, it was instilled in every level of society, through
Right.
education, public discourse, even entertainment.
It's interesting to think about how plays, like Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, were basically their version of a blockbuster movie,
Yeah.
full of all that political intrigue and warnings about the dangers of unchecked ambition.
Absolutely. Those stories really hit home with audiences because they mirrored the anxieties and aspirations of this young republic grappling with the challenges of governing themselves.
I see.
They served as these cautionary tales reminding everyone how fragile republics are
Right.
and how important it is to stay vigilant against anyone who might abuse their power.
Now, America obviously wasn't a carbon copy of the Roman Republic.
Right.
There were clear differences, especially when it comes to women's rights.
Absolutely. That's a really important point. While they drew inspiration from those Roman principles, they also adapted and tweaked them, to fit their own context. And unfortunately, their own prejudices, the exclusion of women from politics,
Right.
it really highlights how far the American experiment fell short of that Roman ideal of full citizen participation.
Right.
And then, of course, you have slavery, which stands as the most glaring contradiction to those ideals.
Yeah, the issue of slavery just can't be avoided when comparing these two societies. Even though we've said that Roman and American slavery were very different, the fact that both nations depended on forced labor really complicates this Rome as a model idea.
It definitely does. It's a really tough and uncomfortable truth.
Yeah.
That a nation built on ideals of liberty and equality could also be a society built on the backs of enslaved people.
Right.
This contradiction is at the very heart of the American story. And it's something we just can't ignore when we look at this Roman influence.
It's a reminder that history is rarely simple.
Yeah. Right?
There are always these nuances and complexities that challenge how we understand things.
Exactly. And as we dig deeper into those influences of Rome on America, we got to keep those complexities in mind and look at both the good and bad parts of that legacy.
Okay, so besides slavery, were there other areas where America went in a different direction than Rome? Were there things about Roman society that the Founding Fathers just didn't want to copy?
One area they were really careful about was the military. Remember, Rome had a professional standing army.
Right.
And their empire was built on military conquest for the most part. The Founding Fathers, though, they were really wary of standing armies. They were afraid a big, powerful military could become a threat to liberty.
Right.
And a tool for tyranny.
Yeah, they much preferred that idea of citizen soldiers.
Exactly.
Like Cincinnatus, who answered the call when needed, but then went back to their normal lives.
Right.
They wanted a military that was strong enough to defend the nation, but not so strong that it could threaten the republic itself.
Exactly. And this tension, between needing security and that fear of the military getting too powerful, it's been a theme throughout American history. It's interesting to think about how the Founding Fathers would view our military today, with its global presence and constant state of readiness. It's a far cry from the citizen militias they imagined back then.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It shows how the challenges a nation faces can change so much over time,
Right.
even while those fundamental questions about power and liberty stay the same.
Yeah.
Speaking of those enduring questions, one thing that seems to have fascinated both the Romans and early Americans was that idea of the rise and fall of civilizations.
Yeah, that cyclical nature of history.
Yeah.
The Romans, they were very aware of the empires that had come and gone before them, and they saw their own republic as part of this big historical cycle and this awareness of how history kind of repeats itself.
Right.
Got passed down to the Founding Fathers and became a deep part of the American way of thinking.
So from the very beginning, there was this underlying worry that America, just like Rome, could eventually decline and fall.
Absolutely. This fear of decline really shaped how they thought and what they did. They were always on the lookout for signs of decay, warning against the dangers of luxury, corruption, and complacency.
Right.
The very things they believed led to Rome's downfall.
It's almost like they were looking in a mirror, seeing Rome's fate as a possible future for their own nation.
In many ways, yeah. And this fear, it wasn't just for the elite either. It was all over popular culture, too.
Oh, yeah.
Think about those grand paintings by Thomas Cole, The Course of Empire.
Yes.
They depict the rise and fall of a civilization.
Yeah, those paintings are such a strong visual representation of that fear, that awareness, that even the greatest civilizations can crumble.
Exactly.
They're like a warning and a challenge all at once. A reminder that things can go downhill, but also a call to action to protect the Republic and learn from those past mistakes.
It really is amazing how one ancient civilization could have such a lasting impact on another one, so far away in time and distance.
What's truly remarkable is that this fascination with Rome is still going strong.
It is.
We see it in our architecture, our political debates, even our entertainment.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy how these echoes of ancient Rome are still all over our culture today.
Yeah.
But is this whole Roman thing just a historical curiosity? Or does it actually have something to say to us in the 21st century?
It'd be easy to just brush it off as, like, a relic of the past. But I think it's a lot deeper than that, honestly.
Okay.
The things that the Founding Fathers were wrestling with, questions about balancing liberty and order, the whole idea of civic virtue, the dangers of corruption and tyranny, those questions are still relevant today.
Right.
Maybe even more so now.
So you're saying by looking back at Rome, we can kind of get a better grip on the stuff we're dealing with today.
Exactly. The Roman example, with all its ups and downs, gives us this valuable way to look at our own society. It's like a case study in how complicated it is to build and keep a republic going.
But America now is so different from the Roman Republic. Even from the America of the Founding Fathers.
Right.
I mean, we're a global superpower. We've got technology they wouldn't have even imagined.
Right.
Does this Roman model really still fit?
That's where it gets really interesting. Sure, the specifics have changed, but the basic questions about human nature, about power, about that balance between freedom and the common good, those are timeless.
So even though we have our smartphones and the internet and space travel and all that, we're still wrestling with the same dilemmas as the Romans.
In a lot of ways, yes. Think about the debates we have now. About political divides, the role of the government, how technology is changing our lives. These are all echoes of arguments that have been going on for ages.
It's like we're still trying to figure out what it really means to be a republic.
Yeah.
To be citizens in a democracy, just like they were back then.
Absolutely. And that Roman example, with all those years of both success and failure, it gives us these really valuable insights into the challenges and the possibilities of governing ourselves. We can learn from their mistakes and get inspiration from what they got right.
But Rome fell.
Right.
Right. Does that mean we're just going to repeat history? Is the American experiment destined to end up like the Roman Republic?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's haunted American thinkers for, forever. And there's no simple answer. But I do think that the Roman example serves as a warning, not like a set-in-stone prophecy.
Okay.
It reminds us that republics are fragile things, that they need us to be on guard, to be active, involved citizens.
So it's not about knowing exactly what will happen. It's about learning from what already did and using those lessons to face the challenges we have now.
Exactly. The Roman example isn't some step-by-step guide to success.
Right.
But it gives us this really rich, complex experience, both good and bad, that we can draw wisdom and inspiration from.
Makes you think what the Founding Fathers would make of America today.
Yeah.
Would they be happy with how far we've come? Or worried about all the stuff we're going through?
That's something for all of us to think about. But I think they'd remind us that this whole American experiment is still ongoing, And it needs constant attention and involvement from all of us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main thing for our listeners to take away from all this? What should they be chewing on after exploring this whole Rome-America connection?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that history matters.
Yeah.
The ideas, the values, the institutions that shape our world.
Right.
They have roots that go way back. And by understanding those roots, we can understand our own present, our own potential so much better.
So next time you see one of those buildings with all the columns, a statue and a toga, or hear someone going on about America's decline, remember that long shadow of Rome.
It's this reminder that the challenges of building and keeping a republic going are timeless. And the choices we make today will shape where our nation goes for generations to come.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring America's obsession with Rome with us. Keep exploring, keep asking those questions, keep learning. Thanks for listening.